One navy sailed 18,000 miles across the globe, not to fight a battle, but to walk into a perfect trap. This is the story of how the Russian Baltic fleet spent 8 months exhausting itself, only to meet Admiral Togo, who had been waiting for them patiently for 300 days in the deadliest choke point in naval history. The trap was called Crossing the T, and it ended an empire. The Winter Palace in St. Petersburg was built to radiate imperial confidence, yet in the first months of 1905, its great halls were thick with the chilling air of desperation. Russia, a continental giant, was being defeated by a young island nation on the other side of the world, and the Tsar's closest advisors saw only one way to avert total humiliation, a gamble so radical, so vast, it defied military logic. The entire Russian Pacific Fleet was already gone, lost in the disastrous siege of Port Arthur. With political unrest simmering in his own cities, the Tsar needed a move dramatic enough to halt the descent into chaos. The only remaining force capable of contesting the seas lay nearly 18,000 miles away, the Baltic Fleet. To propose such a feat was madness. To approve it was self-destruction. Yet, the order was given: take the ships, the crews, the coal, and the hope of an entire empire, and sail them halfway around the globe to win back a war that was already lost. The command fell to Admiral Zinovy Rozhestvensky. He knew the fleet being assembled was a desperate, chaotic collection, a collection of ancient battleships, mismatched cruisers, and a few untested modern vessels, all hastily commissioned. Their crews were raw, untrained conscripts, many having never fired a gun in anger. His flagship, the Knyaz Suvorov, was modern, but it was surrounded by ships whose armor and engines belonged to the previous century. As the fleet prepared to leave the Baltic Sea, its condition was pitiful. The hurried preparations meant maintenance was superficial, training was non-existent, and the ships were coated in a film of thick, telltale rust before they even left European waters. The Tsar had sent him on a mission of salvation. Rozhestvensky knew he was leading a parade to a prearranged funeral. The objective was not just to defeat the Japanese, it was to find them after 18,000 miles of continuous, grueling voyage and somehow fight a decisive battle with a spent, exhausted fleet. The scale of the undertaking was a logistical nightmare unprecedented in naval history. No navy had ever attempted to move such a massive force, fully dependent on foreign coaling stations and neutral ports. They would be sailing across 3 different oceans, fighting the weather, the machinery, and the distance itself. Every mile was a drain on the engines, a chipping away at the crew's endurance, and a slow, painful consumption of the Empire's last military reserve. The journey began in October 1904, and the moment they departed, the sense of doom was palpable. The Russians were no longer sailing as a fighting force. They were sailing as a desperate, traveling target. But they wouldn't just be fighting the Japanese, they would be fighting the laws of physics, because their enemy, Admiral Togo Heihachiro, had already begun preparing the perfect execution. If you're finding this deep dive into historical strategy compelling, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. It helps us bring more of history's greatest untold stories to light. The first weeks of the voyage set the tone for the agonizing months that followed. What began as a hopeful, albeit foolish, endeavor quickly devolved into a slow-motion descent into physical and psychological torment. If there was any doubt about the fleet's readiness, it was dispelled in the cold, dense fog of the North Sea. On the night of October the 21st, the fleet mistook a small group of British fishing trawlers for Japanese torpedo boats, a delusional error given they were still hundreds of miles from any conceivable Japanese presence. The paranoid, exhausted Russian gunners opened fire, sinking one trawler, damaging several others, and causing the loss of life of 2 British fishermen. This incident, known as the Dogger Bank incident, was a spectacular act of self-inflicted damage. It not only demonstrated the raw nerves and abysmal training of the Russian gunners, but it pushed Great Britain, a major neutral power, to the brink of war with Russia. Rozhestvensky's fleet had sailed less than 2,000 miles and was already facing an international crisis. The logistical hell began in earnest once the fleet entered warmer waters. To fuel their continuous passage, the fleet relied on coaling at sea, an arduous process that demanded immense, continuous labor from the crews. The coal was often low-grade, producing clouds of thick, choking black smoke that coated every surface of the ships and the lungs of the men. It was a physically ruinous process, transforming the entire fleet into a spectacle of grime and exhaustion. As they rounded the Cape of Good Hope and entered the Indian Ocean, the environmental conditions became unbearable. The engine rooms were furnaces. The men shoveling coal worked in temperatures that exceeded 140 degrees Fahrenheit, often dropping from heat exhaustion. On deck, the relentless tropical sun cooked the unpainted, rusty decks. Disease and dissent began to spread. What they didn't know was that every puff of black smoke, every drop of sweat, was being monitored. The clock was ticking, and Togo knew exactly how much time they had left. Rozdvensky, the stern but disciplined commander, was forced to contend not just with the elements, but with a rapidly deteriorating command structure. Officers bickered, the men grew sullen and mutinous. Rozdvensky had already publicly denounced his fleet as useless and a burden even before they reached the halfway point. He was acutely aware that he was not leading a battle fleet, but a disorganized, slow-moving column of floating metal and misery. The fleet had to rely almost exclusively on ships from the German Hamburg-America line to replenish its coal supply. This dependence meant they were constantly meeting the coaling ships at specific rendezvous points, a schedule that further dictated their slow, predictable route. They were not a powerful, independent naval force, but a colossal, thirsty train of metal utterly dependent on civilian logistics. By the time the fleet reached the coast of French Indochina, they had been at sea for over 6 months, having sailed nearly 15,000 miles. The ships had suffered engine failures, boiler leaks, and structural damage from the rough seas. The crews were utterly spent, their gunnery practice was minimal, and their morale was crushed. They were a fleet designed for the icy waters of the Baltic, now operating thousands of miles from any repair facility. Having endured the constant psychological strain of knowing their approach was monitored by the Japanese and reported in every newspaper in the world. They were no longer rusty, they were battered. They were no longer tired, they were broken. The final stretch, sailing toward the East China Sea and the inescapable Strait of Tsushima, promised no relief. Every mile they had sailed had stripped them of combat readiness, leaving them only the hollow shell of a fighting force. The trap was set. They just hadn't seen the walls close in yet. The Russian fleet sailed on, their fate sealed by the miles of suffering that separated them from the enemy who was waiting patiently, calmly, for their arrival. While the Russian 2nd Pacific Squadron was slowly agonizing its way across the globe, the Imperial Japanese Navy presented a stark contrast of preparation and professionalism. Their commander, Admiral Togo Heihachiro, known reverently as the Nelson of the East, was a figure of quiet, absolute strategic focus. He had already achieved legendary status by successfully cornering and bringing about the ruin of the Russian Pacific Fleet at Port Arthur, and now he had been given the ultimate prize, the chance to bring about the destruction of the remnants of Russian naval power in a single, decisive stroke. Togo did not chase glory, he pursued tactical perfection. His strategy was built on conservation, intelligence, and patience. Togo was operating close to home, allowing his fleet to be meticulously maintained, his crews rigorously trained, and his ships refitted with the latest technology. This geographical advantage was the first key to victory. His ships were fast, his command was unified, and his crews were veterans of the war's earlier battles. Crucially, the Japanese had a technological edge that would prove devastating: the quality of their ammunition. While Russian shells were largely armor-piercing, designed to punch through a ship's hull but often failing to explode effectively, the Japanese used modern Shimo's high-explosive shells. These shells burst on contact with a ship's structure, creating massive fires, tearing away vital equipment, and, most importantly, destroying the fire control and communication systems necessary to coordinate a battle line. This difference in ordnance would transform the battle from a gun duel into an unparalleled, one-sided calamity. This difference in shells meant the Russian armor plating, which they trusted for survival, would be utterly meaningless in the face of Japanese firepower. The battle wouldn't be won by armor, it would be won by fire. Togo understood that the Russian fleet, after its 18,000-mile odyssey, had only one practical route to its destination, the port of Vladivostok, through the narrow, shallow, and highly monitored Tsushima Strait, which separates Korea and Japan. This strait was the ideal choke point, transforming the vast ocean into a controlled killing field. Togo concentrated his entire effort on this single area. He deployed a screening line of auxiliary cruisers and merchant vessels converted for reconnaissance, establishing an effective surveillance net. While the Russian crews were shoveling coal under the suffocating tropical sun, the Japanese crews were conducting continuous gunnery practice. Togo hammered home the importance of speed, precision, and concentration of fire. His doctrine was simple: focus the fire of multiple ships onto a single target, ensuring its rapid defeat before moving on to the next. Togo himself was an exemplar of calm command. He spent the months of waiting refining his tactics, ensuring every officer understood the overall plan and every sailor knew his role. His leadership was not frantic, it was surgical. He conserved his fleet's strength, avoiding unnecessary engagements, knowing the full prize was approaching. The admiral's confidence radiated through his fleet. They knew they were the professional instrument poised to execute a perfect operation. The Japanese intelligence was flawless. They had been tracking Rozhestvensky's slow progress for months, knowing exactly when and where the exhausted Russian force would attempt to pass through the strait. This ability to wait and to perfectly position their fleet meant that when the two forces met, the Japanese would have every possible advantage: speed, shell superiority, unified command, and, most critically, the ability to choose the time and place of the engagement. The Russians were sailing into a fog of uncertainty, desperately seeking their enemy. The Japanese were waiting in a position of certain strategic superiority, quietly preparing to spring a trap that would rewrite the history of naval warfare. If you are enjoying the detail of this historical setup, please consider sharing this video with someone else who loves deep history. The morning of May the 27th, 1905, dawned cold and foggy over the Tsushima Strait. For Admiral Rozhestvensky and his weary fleet, the fog offered a final, desperate shield. They believed their approach was hidden, allowing them to slip past the Japanese and reach Vladivostok. But the trap, 18,000 miles in the making, was about to snap shut. At 2:45 a.m., the fate of the Russian fleet was sealed not by a battleship, but by a small, silent light cutting through the haze. The Japanese auxiliary cruiser Shinano Maru, repurposed from a British-built liner, spotted the lights of the approaching Russian hospital ship. The auxiliary vessel correctly identified the enemy formation and, without firing a single shot, sent a chillingly simple radio transmission that electrified the command centers of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Enemy fleet sighted in square 203. The message reached Admiral Togo aboard his flagship, the Mikasa. Togo immediately transmitted his now famous battle signal to his waiting fleet. The Imperial Japanese fleet will now commence action. This was followed by another, simpler message that captured the spirit of his entire strategy. The fate of the Empire rests on this action. All hands exert themselves. The sea lanes, moments before shrouded in quiet apprehension, were now alive with movement. Rozhestvensky's formation was slow, cumbersome, and disorganized, largely arranged for defense against torpedo attack rather than offensive maneuver. As the Russian battleships finally cleared the fog, they were met with a sight that must have crushed the last vestiges of their hope. The Japanese battle fleet, fast, organized, and perfectly positioned, streaming directly across their path. Imagine the two fleets as lines. The Russian fleet, sailing north, formed the vertical line of the letter T. The Japanese fleet, having executed a brilliant, calculated turn known as the Mikasa turn, steamed directly across the front of the Russians, forming the horizontal bar. This maneuver gave Togo the ultimate tactical advantage. His entire fleet could bring its full, devastating broadside, all its main guns to bear on the leading Russian ships. In return, the Russians could only fire their two forwardmost guns, a fraction of their firepower, with the rest of their formation struggling to effectively engage a target that was speeding across their bows. The agony for the Russians was the realization of their powerlessness. Rozhestvensky's slow, cold-choked ships were compelled to maintain their course, having no speed or maneuverability left to break free. They were forced to sail, one by one, into the killing zone. The Japanese turn, while risky exposing their unarmored sterns for a brief period, was executed with machine-like precision. It was an act of supreme confidence, betting on the discipline of his crews and the paralysis of his enemy. At 1:55 p.m., the first thunderous salvos were fired. The Japanese gunnery was immediately deadly, precise, and concentrated. The Russian flagship, the Knyaz Suvorov, became the target of sustained fire from multiple Japanese battleships. Within minutes, the decks of the leading Russian ships were engulfed in flames and smoke, not from deep hull penetration, but from the relentless destructive power of the high-explosive shells. The war had been decided not in the final exchange of fire, but in the months of preparation and the precision of this single, brilliant maneuver. The Russian fleet was not engaged in a battle. It was already trapped within the arms of a devastating, strategic trident. This moment of history is why we cover these massive events. If you have a specific battle or historical figure you want to see analyzed next, please comment below. The moment the Japanese shells began landing, the battle ceased to be a tactical engagement and became a process of systematic elimination. The Russian fleet, exhausted by its journey and crippled by obsolete ammunition, was simply no match for the rapid, accurate, and devastating fire of the Japanese. The full terror of the high-explosive Shimo's shells was immediately realized. The explosions were not just destructive, they were incendiary. Fires broke out everywhere, enveloping the Russian battleships in towering columns of white, hot smoke and flame. The shells sliced through communication wires, destroyed rangefinders, and instantly crippled the ability of the Russian ships to coordinate fire. Command became chaos. The flagship, Knyaz Suvorov, was hit repeatedly. Rozhestvensky, severely wounded and unable to issue orders, was effectively neutralized early in the action, leading to a complete collapse of central command. The remaining Russian ships, slow and lacking coordination, broke formation, becoming individual targets for the fast, maneuvering Japanese battle line. The spectacle was terrifying. The veteran Japanese gunners maintained a steady, precise rate of fire, concentrating the firepower of 6 ships onto one Russian target until it was reduced to a flaming wreck, then shifting seamlessly to the next. The Russian return fire was sporadic, inaccurate, and largely ineffective. By the end of the first day, the destruction was nearly absolute. 4 Russian battleships were sunk, including the flagship, and the bulk of the remaining ships were crippled. That night, the Japanese torpedo boat flotillas swarmed the remnants, delivering the coup de grace to the crippled vessels. When the sun rose on May the 28th, the sight was one of utter carnage. Of the 38 Russian ships that entered the strait, 21 were sunk, 6 were captured, and 6 were interned in neutral ports. Only 3 light cruisers and 1 destroyer managed to escape to Vladivostok. The final tally was stark. Over 5,000 Russian sailors perished, and 6,000 more were captured, including Admiral Rozhestvensky himself. The Japanese sustained the loss of 3 torpedo boats and just 116 men. The Battle of Tsushima was the most decisive naval victory in history to that point, a near-total vanquishing of one major world power's fleet by another. The shockwave of this defeat was immediate and profound. Internationally, the victory confirmed Japan's new status as a major world power, earning them international respect and securing favorable terms in the subsequent Treaty of Portsmouth. It was the first time in the modern age that a non-Western power had decisively defeated a Western great power, shaking the foundations of global racial and political assumptions. Domestically, the annihilation of the fleet broke the last vestiges of faith the Russian people had in the Romanov dynasty. The war had been a string of expensive, humiliating defeats, and Tsushima was the final, devastating blow. The revolutionary fervor already gripping the cities intensified. The disaster at Tsushima, an 18,000-mile gamble that ended in complete failure, was not just the end of a fleet, but a crucial, fatal precursor to the political upheaval that would sweep away the Tsarist regime 12 years later. The wreckage of the Russian 2nd Pacific Squadron proved a painful truth. Victory is not guaranteed by size or ambition, but by meticulous preparation and the strategic foresight to recognize a trap before you sail into it. If you want to see more stories about the incredible battles that shaped our world, make sure to like and subscribe to our channel, and let us know in the comments what piece of history you think deserves to be told next.